The fire danced against the crystal windows of the Hofburg Palace, but it was not the reflection of the summer sun that burned the glasses. It was silk burning. Meters and meters of Bordeaux taffeta, golden brocades, and ivory organzas fell on flames controlled in the inner courtyard, while a female figure watched from the balcony, immovable as a marble statue. September 1897. The maids whispered with each other, but no one dared to interrupt Empress Elisabeth of Austria as she watched her gala dresses were consumed by fire. It wasn't just burning fabrics. It was a lifetime of performances, forced smiles, beauty like prison. It was the end of one of the most photographed women in Europe, who had decided to disappear from his own image. The sound of the flames crackled in the Viennese afternoon air, mingling with the embarrassing silence emanating from the palace. Each dress that crumbled into the flames carried decades of mandatory appearances, of measured smiles, of calculated gestures. The ladies of company kept a respectful distance, observing that macabre ceremony of aristocratic self-destruction. Elizabeth remained on the balcony like a sentry by watching her own symbolic funeral, her eyes reflecting not the horror that other women felt, but a strange form of relief. It was burning everything that had turned her from Elisabeth Amelia Eugenia into an imperial porcelain doll. If you are attracted to stories where beauty becomes a curse and power a golden cage, subscribe to our channel to discover the darkest secrets of the European aristocracy. Today, we will unravel the silent tragedy of a woman who tried to burn her own identity to find freedom. Elisabeth Amelia Eugenia was born on December 24, 1837, at the Posnenhofen Palace, on the shores of Lake Starnberg, Bavaria. It was Christmas Eve, and snow covered the palace gardens as a mantle of purity that ironically pre-shaped the tragic complexity that would mark its existence. Daughter of the Maximilian Duke José de Bavaria, he grew up in an atmosphere of almost wild aristocratic freedom. Horses loose on the meadows, informal education, long walks of the Bavarian woods where he could run barefoot and climb trees like any peasant child. But that golden childhood hid the first signs of melancholy that would accompany her for life. Her mother, Ludovica, was an unstable humor woman, obsessed with strategic marriages and social status. Royal Princess of Bavaria. By birth and duchess, by marriage, Ludovica saw in her 8 non-people, but chess pieces in a complex political game where marriage alliances determined the future of European royal houses. The father, Duke Maximilian, was a completely different man. An eccentric who, collecting musical instruments from all over the world, spoke 6 languages and took refuge in his natural history studies whenever political pressure became unbearable. Elizabeth grew in this painful contrast. On the one hand, the mother who saw her as a marriage commodity. On the other hand, the father who offered him intellectual affection but not protection against the ambitions that surrounded his daughters as elegant predators. Freedom of Posnenhof was real but temporary. Elizabeth learned to set up horses before learning label, spoke Bavarian dialect to the servants, and had her hands always dirty of land of the gardens where she planted wildflowers. But even at age 10, she already realized that that life was with her days numbered. The first protocol lessons began when Elizabeth turned 13. French teachers arrived in the morning to teach her the language of European diplomacy. Dance masters came in the afternoon to correct her naturally relaxed stance, and English housekeepers tried to tame her with label classes she supported with forced patience that already revealed her dissociation capacity. Elizabeth learned to divide. On the outside, the young princess who walked with her erect back and smiled at the right time. Inside, the Bavarian girl who dreamed of fleeing to the mountains and never returning. In 1853, at 16, Elizabeth was taken to Bad Ischl for her older sister Helena to be introduced to young Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria. The trip was planned in the smallest detail by Elizabeth's mother and Archduquess Sophia, the emperor's mother, who had traded that meeting for months through encrypted correspondence and family diplomacy. The meeting should be protocol, a formality before the arranged engagement that would unite the houses of Bavaria and Austria in an alliance that would benefit both empires. Elizabeth was included in the entourage only as an escort, a decorative presence not to leave Helena alone during formalities. No one expected her to call attention. At 16, he still had the ants of a clumsy teenager with rebel brown hair that refused to stay trapped in the elaborate hairstyles his mother insisted on doing. But when Franz Joseph saw Elizabeth down the Austrian hotel stairs in Bad Ischl, brown hair down like a silk to the waist, eyes that seemed to reflect the melancholy of the Bavarian lakes, a beauty not yet domesticated by the court, a naturalness that, contrasting violently with the artificiality of other young aristocrats, decided to marry her, not Helena. In 3 days, the engagement was sealed. Elizabeth barely understood what that meant. It had been created to be free, not to be an empress. But Franz Joseph's decision was not just romantic, it was political. At the age of 23, the emperor needed a wife who symbolized renewal, to bring freshness to an aged court, who embodied a beauty capable of fascinating not only the Austro-Hungarian people, but all of Europe. Elizabeth, unknowingly, had become an even more valuable piece in European political chess. The first major break came with the marriage on April 24th, 1854, at the Augustinians' church in Vienna. The ceremony was an imperial spectacle of great proportions. 40,000 people gathered on the streets of Vienna to see the new empress. Artists from all over Europe were hired to create floral decorations that turned the city into a luxury garden, and Elizabeth herself was dressed like a living doll in a white silk dress that weighed more than 15 pounds, due to silver embroidery and pearl applications. Elizabeth entered the cathedral as a 16-year-old Bavarian and came out as an Empress of Austria, but that transformation was more amputation than an elevation. During the ceremony, she had the first panic crisis of her life. Her hands trembled uncontrollably, her breath became superficial, and for a few moments she felt as if she was watching her own marriage out of her own body. The weight of the dress, the warmth of the candles, the look of thousands of strangers, the protocol that even dictated how she should move her lips, all this combined in a feeling of imprisonment that would accompany her for the next 44 years. The Austro-Hungarian court was a relentless label mechanism where each gesture was coded, every measured smile, every heavy word before it was pronounced. There were rules for everything, as an empress should walk, steps of specific size, never very fast, how it should eat, small portions, discreet chewing, never demonstrations of pleasure for food, how it should talk, modulated tones, appropriate subjects, never personal opinions, and even as it should breathe in public, always controlled, never panting, even during long walks. The Archduke Sophia, Elizabeth's mother, in-law, has taken the absolute control of her life, from the dresses she should wear to the hours she should appear in public. Sophia was a woman in her early 50s, extremely intelligent, politically cunning, and completely devoid of female empathy. She had lost 2 children in war and channeled all her emotional energy in shaping the Austro-Hungarian Empire according to her conservative and traditionalist vision. For Sophia, Elizabeth was not a person, but an instrument of imperial power that needed to be constantly tuned. Elizabeth found that being an empress meant disappearing as a person. Her meals were supervised by a protocol that determined not only what she would eat, but how, when, and with whom. Its letters were read by court censors before being sent, and the answers were equally monitored. His tours were timed, his conversations supervised, his moments of loneliness virtually non-existent. She had become a permanent public spectacle, a living museum piece that should always be available for aristocratic visitation. When he gave birth to his first daughter, Sophia, in 1855, the child was immediately taken from his arms and handed over to his paternal grandmother. The Archduchessa Sophia argued that an empress could not be distracted by maternal duties, that the education of princes and princesses was the responsibility of the imperial state, not the parents. Elizabeth had no permission or choose her daughter's name. Sophia was named after her grandmother, a permanent reminder of those who really controlled the dynasty. 2 years later came Gisela, and again the same brutal separation. Motherhood was denied to her at the same moment she was imposed as an imperial duty. The separation routine was always the same. After delivery, Elizabeth was allowed to hold the child for a few minutes, enough time for official photographs that would document the birth of more a member of Habsburg House. Then specially selected milk nominations assumed physical care, while aristocratic governments took care of education. Elizabeth could see her daughters only at predetermined, always supervised times, always following a script of interaction that had been approved by the Archduchess Sophia. The pain of separation manifested physically. Elizabeth developed constant migraines, crises of insomnia that lasted weeks, and episodes of uncontrolled crying that made her prostrate for whole days. Court doctors diagnosed female melancholy and prescribed absolute rest, but rest in the Austro-Hungarian court meant even more isolation, even more supervision, even less autonomy. Elizabeth's beauty, initially her glory, turned into her first prison. She spent 4 hours a day just taking care of her hair. That reached her ankles and weighed almost 2 pounds when loose. The ritual began at 5 in the morning. 2 specialized ladies carefully crumbled the braids of the night before, brushed every 100 times with natural bristle brushes, applied aromatic oils imported from France, and finally rebuilt hairstyles that could take up to 3 hours to be ready. Their ladies of company collected every thread that fell during brushing, keeping them in ivory boxes, as the empress could not leave traces of her humanity scattered throughout the palace. Loose hair represented uncontrolled, and uncontrolled was inadmissible in the Austro-Hungarian court. Elizabeth soon learned that even her most intimate parts, hair, nails, tears, were public property, subject to imperial regulation. The ritual of dress was an even more elaborate ceremony. Tight corsets until his waist has only 50 centimeters, a procedure that often left her with shortness of breath and dizziness. The dresses weighed pounds due to gold embroidery, pearl applications, and fin structures that kept the perfect bell skirts. Jewelry that made her shine but also attached her to the role of the decorative object of the court. Tiaras that caused headaches, necklaces that limited the movement of the neck, so heavy bracelets that they left red marks on their wrists. Elizabeth discovered that dressing like empress was literally a form of refined torture. Each piece of clothing was an instrument of control. The scores prevented deep breathing and sudden movements. Gigantic skirts made it difficult to walk normally. Long gloves prevented the natural use of the hands. She could not lean, could not run, could not make any movement that had not been previously approved by the imperial protocol. In 1858, finally came the long-awaited heir, Rudolf. But once again, Elisabeth was removed from the child. The Archduchessa Sophia assumed the education of the prince, determining that he would be formed according to the rigid principles of Austro-Hungarian military discipline. Rudolf, as a baby, was delivered to the care of a retired general who had been personally chosen by the Archdukees to form the imperial character of the child. Elisabeth watched from afar while her son was transformed into an imperial machine, losing the naturalness and spontaneity she herself had lost years earlier. Rudolf was awakened at 5 a.m. for military exercises, dressed in miniature uniforms, and subjected to such a rigid discipline that at 5 he would no longer smile spontaneously. Rudolf's separation was the first sign that Elisabeth was beginning to break inside irreparably. The nerve crises intensified. Elisabeth began to refuse to appear at public events, claiming diseases that court doctors could not diagnose. It developed real physical symptoms, sudden fevers, rash, intense abdominal pain that seemed to manifest whenever an important public appearance was programmed. It was as if his body had learned to protest against the imprisonment that his mind could not yet verbalize. The 1860s brought the first escapes. Elisabeth developed a travel obsession, especially to places where no one knew her or where she could move with more relative freedom. Corfu became her first refuge. She had the Achillean Palace built on Greek island, a sanctuary where she could walk barefoot, ride horses without saddle, and spend hours reading poetry in German, Greek, and Hungarian. The construction of Achillean revealed aspects of Elisabeth's personality that the Viennese court had never seen. She personally supervised every architectural detail, chose the colors of the walls, designed the gardens, selected the plants that would be cultivated. For the first time since marriage, Elisabeth had absolute control over a space, could make decisions without consulting committees or protocols. The palace became a physical extension of his psyche. Wild gardens that resembled the Bavaria of his childhood, open terraces from which he could contemplate the sea without visual obstacles, simple and stripped rooms that violently contrasting with Vienna's suffocating opulence. Far from Vienna, Elisabeth began to rediscover fragments of herself, but they were painful discoveries. She realized how much she had lost, how she had been stripped of her original essence. In Corfu, she smiled spontaneously again, ran again, made simple choices, as if clothes wear or to read. But these findings were poisoned by the awareness that they were temporary, that he would always have to go back to Vienna, return to the golden prison that was his imperial life. Elisabeth's trips had become increasingly long and erratic. It ran to Europe as a soul, always accompanied by a minimal entourage, avoiding official ceremonies and public apparitions. His routes were unpredictable. Today, he was in London, watching ordinary life on the streets. Tomorrow appeared in Venice, walking alone through the channels. The following week came in Madrid, staying in a modest hotel under false name. Franz Joseph tried to control these escapes through correspondence and family diplomacy, but Elisabeth had developed passive resistance strategies that frustrated all their efforts. She agreed to return to Vienna, but left again 2 weeks later. He agreed to attend official events, but appeared clearly uncomfortable, fulfilling the protocols with a coldness that embarrassed all present. Smile when necessary, but her eyes remained empty, distant, as if she were watching her own life from outside her own body. In 1867, during the coronation as Queen of Hungary, Elisabeth found a deep emotional connection with the Hungarian people. The ceremony was different from any imperial event that she had participated before. Instead of the Austrian coldness, she found warmth. Instead of rigid protocols, he found living traditions that still retained elements of spontaneity and passion. Elisabeth learned Hungarian fluently in 6 months, a linguistic feat that even impressed her critics. She not only memorized words and grammar, but absorbed the musicality of the language, the emotional nuances, the popular saying. For the first time in years, Elisabeth had her own intellectual project, something that connected her with real people outside the aristocratic circuit. She defended the Hungarian political causes with a passion that scandalized the Viennese court. Elisabeth began wearing clothes inspired by the traditional Hungarian costume, decorated her rooms with Hungarian popular art, and insisted that at least 1 meal a day was prepared according to traditional Hungarian recipes. She found in Hungarian nationalism a way to oppose the Austro-Hungarian system that imprisoned her, but even this political passion was, deep down, another form of escape. Elisabeth's obsession with thinness began at this time. It dramatically reduced its diet, weighed compulsively 3 times a day, and developed a routine of exercise that scandalized the court. 6-hour walks by the Vienna parks, gymnastic sessions in a room specially adapted in the palace, and extreme riding that included hazardous and gallop jumps on rugged terrain. It was as if trying to burn his own body, undo the flesh that made it visible and desirable. Elisabeth had intuitively understood that her physical beauty was the basis of her imprisonment. It was because she was beautiful that she had been chosen by Franz Joseph. It was because she was beautiful that she had become the object of public fascination. It was because she was condemned to always be observed, always judged, always controlled. Weight loss has become a mathematical obsession. Elisabeth noted in secret diaries everything she ate, calculated calories with scientific accuracy, and created a system of punishment for herself when she exceeded the food boundaries she had established. If I ate an extra fruit, I was going to walk an hour. If he gave in to the temptation of a dessert, he fasted the next day. Her ladies of company whispered that the Empress was disappearing before her eyes, but no one dared to intervene. Court doctors were consulted, but Elisabeth had become an expert to manipulate medical appointments. She knew exactly what to say to reassure doctors without revealing the actual extension of her obsession. She had learned to systematically lie about her eating habits, to hide food, to simulate normal meals when she was being observed. Extreme thinness brought physical consequences that Elisabeth interpreted as liberation: irregular menstruations, errors that often stopped for months, breast reduction, loss of curvature of the hips. She was literally undoing her physical femininity, turning her body into something that approached a teenager androgynous than a mature woman. It was a form of body resistance to expectations of fertility, sexuality, and maternity that had been imposed on it. In 1886 came the final blow. Rudolf, his only son, his heir, was found dead at the Meyerling hunting pavilion, along with his mistress, Maria Vetsera. The official version spoke of double suicide, but the circumstances remained foggy and contradictory. There was evidence that Rudolf had been suffering intense political pressures, which was being blackmailed for financial reasons, that his relationship with his father had completely deteriorated in recent years. Elisabeth learned of Rudolf's death through a laconic telegram, as if it were any official statement. His Imperial Majesty is informed of the death of Heir Prince Rudolf. Funeral scheduled for Tuesday. Mourning protocols will be sent separately. No consolation word. No explanation of the circumstances, no opportunity to process the mourning privately. They did not even allow her to see her son's body before the funeral. The Archduchessa Sophia, still alive and influential at the age of 80, determined that the prince's body should be prepared according to imperial protocols, without emotional interference from the mother. Elisabeth was authorized only to participate in the funeral as a bereaved decorative figure, another piece in the imperial show of death. At that moment, something inside her was irreparably. Rudolf had been his only real emotional connection within the imperial system. Even separate from her during her childhood, he had grown up maintaining a genuine love for her mother, and in her last years she had become her confidant and political ally. With the death of Rudolf, Elisabeth lost not only a son, but the last person in the world who understood her authentically. The mysterious circumstances of Rudolf's death haunted Elisabeth for the rest of his life. She suspected that the suicide had been a consequence of the impossible pressures that the imperial system had on its members, the same pressures that it had been trying to escape through escapes and symbolic resistances. Rudolf had chosen the definitive escape, and Elisabeth blamed himself for not being able to save him, not being able to offer him alternatives to despair. After Rudolf's death, Elisabeth adopted black as an exclusive color. It was not just traditional mourning, it was a statement that she herself had died with her son. His public appearances had become ghostly, a tall figure, always black, with a face covered with thick veils or strategically positioned fans to prevent photographs. She categorically refused to be photographed and had any unauthorized image destroyed. Developing a network of informants who warned her about the presence of photographers at public events and created elaborate strategies to avoid being captured in images, wide flap hats, opaque veils, always open fans covering the face, quick movements that made the photographic focus impossible. It was like trying to erase the visual history of his own time. Elisabeth had understood, before any theory about the society of the show, that the images were instruments of power and control. By refusing to be photographed, she was refusing to feed the imperial machine that turned her person into visual commodity. The trips intensified almost manically after Rudolf's death. Elisabeth roamed Europe as an aristocratic nomad, never staying more than a few weeks in the same place. It avoided Vienna at all costs. The city had become a mausoleum of everything she had lost. Each street, every palace, each park was haunted by memories of a life that it now considered completely wasted. In his letters to the sisters, which he rarely sent and were always brief, wrote with terrible lucidity about his condition. "I am a still-breathing dead. My only wish is to let me disappear in peace. I do not know why I still interpret this role of empress when the person who was Elisabeth died with Rudolf. It was then that the rituals of systematic destruction began." Elisabeth had a gala dressed after each use, as if she could not stand that they left evidence of her imperial performance. Each burnt dress was a representation that refused to repeat, a lie that would not count again, a scam from which it was symbolically free. She donated or destroyed most of her jewelry, keeping only the pieces strictly necessary, not to cause total public scandal. His art collections were discreetly dismantled and sold, marriage gifts were returned to donors or sent to museums, personal effects were being eliminated one by one until their quarters became almost monastic spaces. His quarters in the palaces were being methodically emptied. First the decorative objects, then the non-essential furniture, then the curtains and rugs, until only the absolutely functional elements remain: a bed, a desk, a chair, a mirror. Elisabeth was creating physical spaces that reflected her emotional state. Empty, stripped, reduced to the minimum necessary for survival. The episode of Dress burns on the Hofburg courtyard in September 1897 was the apex of this calculated symbolic self, destruction. Elisabeth had all her gala dresses over the past 5, about 40 pieces of invaluable value, created by the best couturiers in Paris and Vienna, and burned them methodically one by one for a whole afternoon. When questioned by his closest lady of company about the reason for that macabre ritual, Elisabeth responded with a frightening clarity: "These are fantasies of a person who no longer exists. I can't keep keeping clothes to play a role that kills me slowly. Each dress is a lie that I told myself. Fire has consumed not only silk and brocade, but decades of imperial representation, of beauty as a mandatory performance, of identity as golden prison." The flames were hypnotic, almost ritualistically purifying. Elisabeth watched that destruction with a serenity that scared everyone around her. It was as if she were finally doing something truly yours, something no one could control or censor. In the following months, Elisabeth became even more erratic and unpredictable. She traveled with false names: Hohenheim's Countess, Sutter Duchess, Madame Nicolix, avoided luxury hotels, preferring modest pensions where she could go unnoticed, and walked for hours through the cities without apparent destination, as if she looked for something that had lost for decades and may never find again. In her letters, which sent sporadically to Franz Joseph, she wrote as if she were a foreigner reporting someone else's life. The Empress is well physically, but increasingly emotionally distant. She watches the world through blurred glass and no longer recognizes her own reflection. I sometimes wonder if it still exists, or if it's just a shadow that insists on walking around the world. Franz Joseph desperately tried to reconnect her to imperial reality through affectionate correspondence and invitations to definitely return to Vienna. But Elisabeth had developed a passive resistance that made any attempt to control impossible. She responded to letters politely but distant, as if talking about someone she had known for a long time but had not seen for years. On September 10th, 1898, Elisabeth was staying at the Beau Rivage Hotel in Geneva under the name of Hohenheim Countess. It was a modest hotel, chosen precisely for its discretion and the possibility of staying anonymous. She had spent the morning walking on the banks of Lake Léman alone, consciously avoiding the entourage that followed her in respectful distance according to her instructions. It was one of his meditative walks, daily rituals, where he tried to find some trace of inner peace through the contemplation of nature. Elisabeth had developed a personal philosophy that combined elements of Buddhism, which she had studied through French translations, Greco-Stoicism, which read in the original, and German Romanticism. These walks were their moments of spiritual practice, attempts to connect with something greater than transcending her from the arrest of her imperial identity. At 1:35 p.m., while heading to the Genève steam that would take her to Montreux, a young Italian anarchist named Luigi Luciani approached her. Luciani was 25, an orphan since childhood, had worked as a construction in several European countries, and had been politically radicalized by reading anarchist pamphlets circulating among immigrant workers. Luciani had originally planned to murder Prince Henri d'Orléans, but when he discovered through local newspapers that Empress Elisabeth was in Geneva, she decided that she would be an equally symbolic and politically impactful target. For him, Elisabeth represented all that the European anarchist movement hated: aristocratic privilege, ostentatious wealth, luxurious life supported by the work of millions of exploited workers. He approached as if they were going to greet it, a common gesture at the time, as many people recognized royalty members and made respectful reverences on the streets. But instead of a greeting, Luciani dug a 4-inch triangular lime into his chest, piercing his heart with surgical precision. The weapon had been chosen carefully, small enough to be hidden, sharp enough to be lethal, and common enough not to raise suspicions if it was discovered. Elisabeth staggered, but did not fall immediately. The lime had pierced the pericardium and the heart, but so that it allowed it to remain conscious for a few minutes. She still managed to board the steam, where she passed out about 10 minutes later when the inner bleeding finally compromised her conscience. He died at 2:10 p.m. without recovering consciousness, surrounded by strangers who desperately tried to save it without understanding the extent of the injuries. The news of Elisabeth's death shocked Europe not only for the sudden violence of the murder, but for the cruel symbolism of the situation. The Empress, who had spent decades trying to disappear from her own life, had been eliminated by someone who did not even know her personally, who had chosen her as a target, not whom she was as a person, but from what she represented as a political symbol. Luciani later declared during the trial that he had chosen Elisabeth precisely because she represented everything he hated about the European aristocracy: the ostentatious luxury, the hereditary privilege, beauty as a form of social power. Ironically, he did not understand that Elisabeth had been trying to symbolically kill what he hated in it for years. But perhaps the greatest irony was that Lucchini had done what Elisabeth had not been able to do alone, to definitely free her from the role of empress. The empress who died in Geneva was no longer the young Bavarian who had enchanted Franz Joseph and Bad Ischl, nor the imperial beauty that had fascinated Europe for 2 decades. She was a woman who had burned her own gala dresses, who had tried to erase her own image, who walked through the European cities as an anonymous in search of an identity she had never really had. Elizabeth's funeral was a great imperial ceremony with meticulously planned pomp and protocol, exactly everything she had spent her life trying to avoid. Franz Joseph, who had lost his wife emotionally decades before she died physically, cried before a coffin that contained the remains of someone who had been a ghost for years, the crowds that clustered on the streets of Vienna to see her last, in fact, paying tribute to a memory, an image that Elisabeth herself had systematically tried to incinerate during her last years of life. Elisabeth's imperial show of death was the final representation of everything she had rejected, the transformation of her person into public contemplation. In the years following his death, Elisabeth became a European romantic worship figure. Movies, books, operettas, and then musicals perpetuated a completely romanticized version of their history, systematically ignoring the brutality of their royal experience, that of a woman who was transformed into imperial decorative object and has spent 4 decades trying to desperately recover some form of authentic humanity. Popular culture created myths about Elisabeth that would have caused horror in the empress itself. The woman who died of love, the beauty that sacrificed the empire, the romantic that lived a tragic fairy tale. All these interpretations completely ignored the reality of their experience. Elisabeth was not a romantic. He was a prisoner. He did not die of love. He died trying to escape the love that had become prison. He did not live a fairy tale, lived a golden nightmare from which he could only escape through death. What was left of Elisabeth was not his burnt dresses or desperate escapes, but a question that still resonates more than a century after his death. Is it possible to be a woman, to be beautiful and to be free simultaneously when beauty becomes a form of power and social control? Elisabeth tried to find an answer burning symbolically all that made her visible, but found that even invisibility has its limits. After all, an empress cannot simply disappear from the world without leaving trace or political consequences. His tragedy was not just personal, it was archetypal and prophetic. Elisabeth embodied the dilemma of countless women who discovered that their beauty and status were simultaneously their glory and condemnation. It has anticipated, viscerally and self-destructively, issues on female identity, public visibility, and personal autonomy that still haunt our hyper-connected culture and obsessed with the image. At a time when social networks turn ordinary women into permanent public shows, in which female beauty remains goodbye and controlled by predominantly male power structures, Elisabeth's story gains an almost prophetic relevance. She understood, a century before any feminist theorization on the subject, that female beauty can be a particularly sophisticated and cruel form of prison. The fire that consumed its dresses in the Hofburg courtyard in September 1897 was not just an act of personal despair. It was a resistance ritual, a desperate attempt to incinerate the social expectations that had turned it into a prisoner of its own image. Elisabeth understood, perhaps intuitively, that to be genuinely free would need to stop being seen as an object of desire, to stop being admired as a symbol of beauty, to stop Elisabeth as the world had defined her. But the freedom she sought was structurally impossible within the parameters of her time and her social position. The only real escape would have demanded courage that not even she had, to completely abandon her title, her wealth, her imperial identity, and to rebuild as a completely anonymous person in another country, with another name, another story. Instead, she chose a shape of slow and symbolic suicide, burning piece by piece everything that made her recognizable as an empress, but never being able to completely burn the social structures that supported her imprisonment. It was like trying to escape a prison by burning only the bars, but leaving the walls, the ceiling, the foundations intact. Elisabeth's physical death in Geneva was, paradoxically, almost a relief, the end of an agony that lasted decades. Luigi Lucchini believed he was killing a symbol of aristocratic privilege, but was actually giving the final blow to a woman who had been trying to symbolically kill herself for years. Elisabeth had tried to symbolically commit suicide for decades. Lucchini just completed a process she had started herself but could not finish. Today, more than a century later, Elisabeth's story continues to fascinate and disturb precisely because she anticipated contemporary dilemmas about public image, aesthetic pressure, and loss of identity that became even more sharply in the digital age. The tragedy of the empress who burned his own dresses gains almost prophetic relevance when we consider how many contemporary women feel similarly imprisoned by their own public images. Elisabeth understood, before any theorization about the society of the show's spectacle or culture of celebrity, that public visibility can be a form of death in life, which is constantly observed and judged can destroy any possibility of authentic existence. His attempts at invisibility, their rituals of symbolic destruction, their geographical escapes were psychological survival strategies that anticipated tactics still used today by people who feel imprisoned by their own fame or notoriety. The ritual burnings were acts of poetic resistance, desperate attempts to incinerate not only expensive tissues, but the social expectations that the tissues represented. Each dress she burned was an imperial performance that refused to repeat, a forced smile that would no longer give a public appearance that categorically rejected. It was his way of saying no, even when all the social structures of his day prevented her from pronouncing that word aloud. But Elisabeth discovered the terrible truth about symbolic resistance. It is impossible to symbolically burn without literally burning. Her attempt to erase her own image resulted in a form of death in life. She became a ghost of herself, a woman who walked around the world as a shadow she had been. The freedom that sought through symbolic self-destruction was a new form of arrest, that of absolute isolation, the inability to connect authentically with anyone or experience. Elisabeth's tragedy was not only individual, it was representative of a whole time and a conception of aristocratic femininity. She embodied the fundamental contradictions of a society that idealized female beauty while turning it into an instrument of social control. Her beauty was her perdition, not because she was vain or superficial, but because the society of her day was structurally unable to conceive a beautiful woman who was also genuinely autonomous. The Austro-Hungarian imperial system turned Elisabeth into a golden prisoner. But the problem was not only the specific system, it was the structural impossibility of reconciling feminine beauty, public visibility, and personal freedom within any social system that turns women into objects of contemplation. Elisabeth des, he forced him no matter how many dresses burned, how many trips he made, or how drastically tried to alter his physical appearance. As long as he remained Empress Elisabeth, he would remain imprisoned by his own identity. Elisabeth's most disturbing legacy is perhaps the realization that her resistance strategies, the refusal of visibility, the symbolic destruction of her own image, isolation as a way of protecting intimacy, remain tactical used by contemporary women who feel imprisoned by their own beauty, fame, or public exposure. The difference is that today, these tactics are even less effective, as digital technology makes genuine anonymity almost impossible. Elisabeth burned her gala dresses because she intuitively understood that they were her golden chains, the physical instruments that kept her attached to the role of public spectacle. But it found out too late that burning the currents is not enough if the prison cannot be completely abandoned. His tragedy was trying to find freedom within the limits of the system that imprisoned it, never being able to imagine a life completely out of it. Elisabeth's aristocratic education had been so complete that she was literally unable to imagine herself as an ordinary person. Even in her escape fantasies, she remained the empress disguised, the aristocrat in exile, never simply an anonymous woman building an authentic life. Her identity was so cast with her social role that separating from each other would have required a form of psychological death she could not fully accept. Today, when we look at the ashes of the dresses Elisabeth burned in the Hofburg courtyard, we don't just see the symbolic destruction of expensive clothes. We see the material testimony of a woman who viscerally and anticipatedly understood that female beauty can be both power and arrest, and who has consciously chosen to incinerate her own power in the desperate hope of escaping from prison. Flames that consumed those gala dresses in September 1897 also burned decades of forced conformity, mandatory smiles, imperial femininity performances that had literally consumed the royal person who existed before Elisabeth became the empress. It was a ritual of purification through fire, an attempt to burn not only tissues, but whole layers of false identity that had accumulated over 4 decades. But the fire also revealed the tragic dimension of its situation. Even burning all the external symbols of its imperial condition, Elisabeth could not burn the social structure that made these symbols necessary. It was like an actor trying to escape a role by burning the costumes, but being forced to continue representing even without appropriate clothes. The empress who burned her gala dresses died as she had lived her last years, alone, fundamentally misunderstood, and desperately trying to be invisible in a world that insisted on looking at her as a public spectacle. Her death in Geneva was just the end point of a farewell letter she had been writing for decades, one word at a time, one dress burned at a time, one escape at a time. Elisabeth understood something that her time was not prepared to accept, that for some women, in certain historical circumstances, the only possible form of freedom can be the freedom of extinction itself. It is a terrible and beautiful lesson, which still resonates today in every woman who feels imprisoned for her own visibility, her own beauty, her own inability to be simultaneously seen and free. The fire that consumed Elisabeth's dresses in the fall of 1897 still symbolically burns more than a century later, illuminating fundamental issues that our society has not yet been able to solve completely. Perhaps this is why his story will continue to fascinate and disturb us. because Elisabeth had the courage to ask questions that we still can't answer completely and seek a form of freedom that we may not yet know how to offer women. His life was a tragic experiment on the limits of female resistance within patriarchal power systems. She tested all possible strategies: geographical escape, aesthetic resistance, motherhood refusal, symbolic self, destruction, and found that none of them was enough to completely break the structures that imprisoned her. But their attempts failed, not for lack of courage or intelligence, but because the problem was structural, not individual. Elisabeth anticipated, in a visceral and self-destructive way, contemporary debates about female agency, body autonomy, and the right to privacy that became central in current feminist theory. She intuitively understood that control, obtaining its own image, is a fundamental political issue, that beauty can be a form of oppression, and that public visibility can be incompatible with personal authenticity. But perhaps its most important contribution to our understanding of the feminine condition is to have demonstrated, through its own destruction, that women's freedom cannot be achieved through purely individual strategies. Elisabeth burned her dresses, fled geographically, refused to be photographed, destroyed status symbols, but all these resistance tactics remained limited because they did not attack the structural roots of the system that imprisoned it. Its tragedy teaches us that true female freedom requires not only individual courage, but collective social transformations that we are still trying to build. Elisabeth was a tragic pioneer of this struggle, a woman who died trying to solve problems individually that can only be solved collectively. When we observe our contemporary culture, obsessive by images, addicted to a spectacle, unable to allow public lives to have genuine private lives, we see that many of the problems that tormented Elisabeth remain unresolved. The difference is that today, millions of ordinary women experience attenuated versions of the same dilemma that it has faced extremely: how to be seen without being objectified, how to be beautiful without being imprisoned by its own beauty, how to have a public identity without losing its private soul. Elisabeth burned her gala dresses in 1897, but the fire she lit continues to burn in the awareness of all women who feel imprisoned by aesthetic expectations, image pressures, or the impossibility of being simultaneously visible and free. She failed to escape her golden prison, but has begun a visceral understanding of how this prison works and why she must be destroyed. Its history remains a warning about the human costs of social systems that turn women into objects of contemplation, and as a testimony of the courage needed to resist these systems, even when resistance seems impossible. Elisabeth died trying to be free, and his death illuminates both the urgency and difficulty of this freedom that we still seek to build collectively. The September 1897 fire in the Hofburg courtyard was more than a clothing burning. It was a still echoing resistance ritual, a rebellion flame that continues to inspire all women who refuse to accept that beauty and freedom are mutually exclusive. Elisabeth failed to solve this impossible equation, but her desperate and brave attempt continues to teach us about the nature of oppression and the need for freedom.